Welcome to the deep dive. We're jumping straight into a topic that, well, it feels ripped right from the pages of legend. The stories of Billy the Kid and Jesse James.
Absolutely. I mean, these names are just synonymous with the American Old West, aren't they?
They really are icons woven so deep into the mythology. They evoke these images of, daring escapes, shootouts, rebellion.
Hmm. And because those legends are so powerful, it can be really tough sometimes to separate the real person from that larger-than-life character.
Exactly. So our mission today is to try and cut through some of that folklore. We've got our source material here, this article called The True Stories of Billy the Kid and Jesse James.
Right.
And we're going to use it as our guide, really dig in and uncover the reality behind the images. What do these sources actually tell us about their lives, how they got so notorious, and, how their stories got spun into legend?
And you're going to find, I think, that the truth, at least as it's presented in this source, it's often way more complex, messier even, and maybe, in some ways, more compelling than the simple myths we often hear.
Okay, so we'll look at where they came from, their most infamous actions, the people who crossed their paths.
For better or worse, yeah.
Right. And how the turbulent times they lived in shaped everything. So get ready for some details that might genuinely surprise you. Let's unpack this.
Sounds good. Where should we start? Billy the Kid.
Yeah, let's start with Billy. When you hear that name, you picture this, lean, fast-shooting young guy out on the range.
It's a classic image.
But the source tells us his beginnings were pretty far from that. He wasn't actually born Billy the Kid out west.
Right, that's one of the first sort of surprises in the article. He was born Henry McCarthy.
Henry McCarthy.
In New York City, of all places, back in 1859. The name William H. Bonney, that came later.
Yeah.
And Billy the Kid, the famous moniker, even later than that.
New York City, wow, okay. That's a twist right off the bat. So his journey into crime didn't start on the frontier then?
No. And the source notes he was orphaned quite young. His mother died in New Mexico.
That's a really tough start for anyone, especially back then. Did his turn to crime happen pretty quickly after that?
It seems like it accelerated rapidly, yeah. The source describes him moving from, petty theft, then to horse stealing,
Okay.
and then, crucially, to murder while still very young.
Which brings us to that first killing you mentioned, Francis Cahill in Arizona, during a bar fight.
Yes. And this is where the complexity, or maybe the myth-making, starts almost immediately.
How so?
Well, the source points out that while Cahill definitely died from the encounter, some witnesses apparently claimed Billy acted in self-defense.
Okay. So right from the very beginning, his actions weren't necessarily painted as purely cold-blooded, even though the outcome was fatal and, well, it set him on a certain path.
Exactly. It wasn't clear-cut. And his story then gets deeply tangled up with the Lincoln County War in New Mexico.
Right, the Lincoln County War. The source highlights John Tunstall as a really key figure here, describes him as a, fair-minded English cattle baron?
Yeah, who apparently took Billy under his wing, treated him with some respect.
That mentorship must have been significant. Maybe offered Billy a glimpse of a different kind of life, a more legitimate one.
Possibly. But Tunstall's murder in 1878, that was the explosion. Carried out by a rival economic faction, supported by a corrupt sheriff, apparently. It was the catalyst.
So Tunstall's death wasn't just, a random crime. It was political, part of this local power struggle.
Definitely.
And that death seems to have completely defined Billy's response. He didn't turn to the law, did he? He helped form this vigilante group, the Regulators.
Exactly. These were men, Billy included, who basically decided to take the law into their own hands to avenge Tunstall and fight his rivals.
And this sparked the actual Lincoln County War, this bloody, chaotic conflict. Regulators versus the rival faction versus law enforcement like Sheriff William Brady.
Yeah, and the Regulators, including Billy, they did kill Sheriff Brady and others tied to that opposing side. So, direct retaliation.
But the source also details specific events during the war that add some layers to that reckless kid image, right? Like the Battle of Lincoln.
Right. He isn't just portrayed as a killer there. The source mentions him showing real bravery, even strategic thinking, helping companions escape a burning building while they were under siege by the U.S. Army.
Wow. Under siege by the Army. That's more than just simple outlaw behavior.
It shows another side, doesn't it? Resourcefulness, maybe loyalty, courage under, extreme pressure. But despite his actions, he wasn't immune to betrayal himself.
He actually tried to go straight? Is that what the source says?
Yeah, apparently he sought amnesty from the governor, Lew Wallace. Even testified in court, seemed genuinely willing to turn over a new leaf.
But
But despite these good faith efforts, he was betrayed, thrown in jail anyway.
you can imagine how that would harden a young man who'd already seen so much violence and death.
Absolutely. And that betrayal, it seems, led directly to another escape and him going right back to the outlaw life.
And the source even includes that incredible detail, the story about him outwitting a would-be assassin.
Oh yeah, by rotating the cylinder of a revolver so it fired on an empty chamber.
That takes unbelievable presence of mind in a life-or-death situation.
It really does. A striking example of his cunning.
Mm.
But, eventually, his luck just ran out. Sheriff Pat Garrett became absolutely determined to capture him.
And Garrett finally did catch him. Billy was sentenced to hang for killing Sheriff Brady. But knowing Billy...
He wasn't going to go quietly. No, he pulled off one last really dramatic escape. Killed 2 deputies in the process.
But Garrett was persistent.
Extremely. The source recounts the final confrontation. Garrett tracked him to the home of a mutual friend, Pete Maxwell's place.
And the detail from the source's description that just kind of haunts you is that moment in the dark.
Yeah.
Where Billy apparently called out asking who was there, and in doing so, unknowingly identified himself just before Garrett shot him.
An almost accidental end, in a way, for someone who seemed to thrive on deliberate action and quick thinking.
And he died at just 21.
Only 21 years old. A brief, incredibly violent life that, as the source points out, very quickly solidified his image as this tragic symbol of rebellion in the American West.
A short, explosive life. Became instant legend material. Okay, so if Billy the Kid's story is rooted in that chaotic post-Civil War frontier of New Mexico, Jesse James's path to infamy was forged directly in the Civil War itself, right, back in Missouri.
That's a really crucial distinction, yeah. Jesse James got into violence incredibly early by joining the Bushwhackers.
Bushwhackers? These were Confederate guerrillas.
Exactly. Fighting this really vicious, irregular war against Union forces in Missouri during the Civil War. This wasn't just generic banditry starting out. It was violence with a very clear, intense political and regional identity right from the get-go.
And he was wounded during the war.
He was, yeah. And the source mentions he was nursed back to health by his cousin, who later became his wife, Zeralda Mims.
A little bit of personal story mixed into all that violence.
A moment of calm in the storm, maybe. But the post-war context in Missouri is just essential to understanding what happened next. The state was deeply, violently divided.
Still reeling from the war.
Absolutely. And Jesse and his brother Frank, having fought for the Confederacy, they essentially rejected the new Union-backed order that was imposed after the war. They didn't just lay down their arms and reintegrate.
So they turned their wartime skills elsewhere.
Pretty much. They turned to crime, became bandits, but importantly, they often framed their actions within that lingering Confederate resentment and resistance.
And this is where the myth-making really takes off, maybe even more overtly than with Billy the Kid. The source mentions Jesse's fame just exploded after he supposedly mistakenly killed a bank clerk.
Yeah, during a robbery he reportedly claimed was meant to avenge his fallen Confederate leader, whether that was true or just justification after the fact.
Hard to say, but who was key in spinning that into a public narrative?
The source identifies a guy named John Newman Edwards, a pro-Confederate newspaper editor. Apparently, he actively worked to transform Jesse's image.
So he wasn't just reporting facts, he was actively crafting a narrative, painting Jesse as what? A Southern Robin Hood.
That's the idea the source suggests, yeah. A folk hero striking back against Northern exploitation, against the perceived injustices of this new post-war order.
And the gang helped reinforce that image with their targets.
Seems like it. The source mentions they specifically went after banks, stagecoaches, railroads, things often tied to Northern interests or seen as symbols of that new order.
So it wasn't just about the money. Every robbery could be framed politically.
Right, which resonated, obviously, with a sympathetic Southern audience who felt similarly wronged or displaced by the outcome of the war.
That must have made them incredibly popular with certain people, even while they were, committing crimes. But actions like that also attract serious attention. The Pinkertons.
Oh, yeah. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency, hired by the businesses getting robbed.
And when the Pinkertons got involved, things escalated. The source describes a notorious incident, a failed raid on the Juddings family home.
Yes, and that raid had these tragic, really unintended consequences. It resulted in the death of a young child, Jesse's half-brother, and the severe maiming of his mother. Her arm was injured, possibly by a device they threw in.
Oh, wow. That's brutal.
And it was a critical turning point in public perception. This heavy-handed action by a Northern-based agency against his family, It generated immense public sympathy for Jesse.
Even among people who might not have approved of the robberies before.
Exactly. It further solidified that mythic status, the victim fighting back against these oppressive forces.
Despite all this heat, all the attention, Jesse just couldn't seem to quit. The source talks about his most ambitious plan, the robbery of the First National Bank up in Northfield, Minnesota.
Northfield, that was a disaster for the James gang. A complete disaster.
How so?
The townspeople fought back. Like, really fought back. Brave folks. The result was catastrophic for the gang. Many members killed or captured. It was a major, major blow. Really signaled the beginning of the end for that original group.
So after Northfield, Jesse's career is kind of on the decline, but he still can't stop robbing. He's living under aliases.
Yeah, but the pull of crime seemed too strong. His brother Frank, interestingly, did eventually leave the outlaw life.
But Jesse kept going.
Kept going. Recruited new, probably less reliable associates, including these two brothers, Robert and Charlie Ford.
Ah, the Fords. And this is where the final betrayal comes in.
It is. Unknown to Jesse, Robert Ford had cut a deal with the governor of Missouri.
For the bounty money.
For the bounty on Jesse's head, yeah. In exchange for bringing him in dead or alive.
Speaks volumes about the price on his head and, well, the nature of trust in that world.
It really does.
Yeah.
And the moment of the assassination, as the source describes it, it's almost startlingly mundane. Jesse was unarmed, standing on a chair, dusting off a picture on the wall in his home, preparing for another trip, apparently.
And Robert Ford just...
Shot him in the back of the head, April 1882.
Wow. The public reaction to Ford killing him must have been huge, but maybe not what Ford expected?
Overwhelmingly negative, according to the source. Just immense outrage that this legendary figure, regardless of his crimes, was shot in the back by a supposed friend for money.
So Ford gets his pardon, but...
Lived a haunted life, apparently. Never fully accepted. A pariah, really.
And in this final, almost unbelievable twist, the source mentions Robert Ford himself was later killed.
Yeah, by a man named Edward O'Kelly. And O'Kelly supposedly declared himself the man who killed Jesse James.
Good grief. The myth had become so powerful that even killing the killer was a path to notoriety.
It's a dramatically theatrical end to that whole narrative arc, isn't it?
It really is. So looking at both of their lives now through the lens of this source material, Billy the Kid, Jesse James, what are the big themes that really jump out?
Well, the most obvious one, I think, reinforced again and again in both stories, is that huge gap between myth and reality.
Definitely. The myths paint Billy as this, doomed youth fighting corruption, a symbol of rebellion. Jesse as the noble Confederate avenger, the Southern Robin Hood.
Right. But the reality the source presents is just much more complex and, frankly, less noble. Their actions seem driven often by vengeance.
Billy avenging Tunstall, Jesse avenging perceived wrongs from the war.
Exactly. And by survival, by opportunity, by the circumstances of their incredibly turbulent world. It wasn't really about some pure noble cause most of the time. It was about living, making choices in a really difficult, violent era.
There's also that clear theme of the tragedy of fame.
Oh, absolutely. Their notoriety, the very thing that made them household names and legends, is exactly what drew the relentless attention of lawmen like Garrett and the Pinkertons.
And ultimately led to their betrayal and premature deaths. Their fame was, in a way, a fatal burden.
And ironically, as the source notes, their legends just exploded even further after they died.
Right. The dime novels, the sensational newspaper articles, the plays, later Hollywood movies. They all took the messy reality and just polished it into these enduring myths we know today, often simplifying the motivations, glossing over the brutality.
Their stories, especially Jesse's, I think, also offer this really interesting window into the deep social fractures of post-Civil War America.
Yeah, the source definitely highlights how their lives and the narratives built around them reflect that tension, that clash between sort of rural Confederate loyalty and the encroaching industrial capitalist North.
Their actions and the way certain people embraced them weren't just random crimes. They were partly products of that huge unresolved conflict.
It's fascinating how individual lives can become these lightning rods for much bigger societal issues.
Yeah, and how those unresolved conflicts created an environment where figures like this could emerge and be seen, at least by some, not just as criminals, but as symbols. Symbols of resistance against forces that felt threatening or unjust.
So as we wrap up this deep dive then, going back to the source material really does force you to look past those simple hero or villain narratives we get so often.
It really does. You see, the complicated mix in Billy's life Was it self-defense? Was it cold-blooded action? Probably both at different times.
And with Jesse, those blurring lines between rebellion and just plain banditry.
And you see the immense power, almost immediate power, of that post-mortem myth-making.
Yeah.
And how both their stories were absolutely products of the incredibly turbulent times they lived in, especially those deep divisions after the Civil War.
It really makes you stop and think, doesn't it, about how readily we consume and maybe even perpetuate these larger-than-life stories.
Mm-hmm.
So here's maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider. Look around today. Historical figures, contemporary figures, even fictional characters that capture the public imagination. How are we still creating and perpetuating myths?
That's a great question.
And what does that tell us about our own needs? Our needs for heroes, for villains, for symbols that maybe help us make sense of the complex social and political changes happening right now around us.
Something to definitely ponder long after this deep dive is over.
Indeed. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the real stories, or at least a closer look at the stories, behind Billy the Kid and Jesse James.
Hope it gave you a new perspective on two really enduring figures of the American West.